Detective David had been called to investigate a missing person case involving the disappearance of an ornithologist who had just arrived in town. And even though he was well experienced and had already heard of many unbelievable cases that almost seemed to compete with fiction, nothing would have prepared him for what happened that week. The case involved a young biologist who specialized in studying bird behavior and had recently moved into a small town in the middle of the woods. But it had been 3 days since anyone had seen or heard anything about Michael, the ornithologist, not his fellow researchers nor the neighbors, and thus Detective David was called into the scene. David reported the neighborhood was calm and seemingly safe. Most of the neighbors were already elders, and when David had the chance to question them, they would answer something along the lines of, "Well, I don't know much about the kid. Haven't been able to know him too well. Is he lost again?" It seemed the biologist was passionate, to say the least, and his excitement while bird-watching won over him many times. Something that added to his lack of awareness of the area resulted in Michael getting lost a couple of times in the previous months. But something was strange. He had never been lost for so long. And now, people reported that they had been hearing strange sounds coming from his house. But David couldn't even imagine the mystery that awaited on the other side of the door. A case that would end with him in tears and in awe of the complex relations between society and nature. Detective David had to knock a couple of times before entering the house. Of course, he received no answer, and the knock echoed all over the neighborhood. Having no choice but to enter, the detective forced the door open and was immediately shocked by what he saw. The whole house was destroyed. The scene in front of him was a mess. Every drawer was wide open, and their insides were all scrambled over the floor, where papers and folders and pictures and books and scientific magazines adorned. There was not a single place in the living room that was not upside down. The detective checked the remaining locations, the bedroom, the bathroom, and the studio. It all was the same, as if someone had been desperately searching for something. The detective thought things were getting interesting as he searched for any kind of clue or a sign that the house had been the scenario for a violent struggle, but his investigation was fruitless. The documents on the floor haven't been stepped on. Their contents were all related to the study of different birds of the zone. There was no broken furniture nor signs of a violent encounter, but there were still a lot of other possibilities the detective couldn't discard yet. He knew well that the stranger the case, the more unexpected the answer would be. But still, even with all his years of experience, what happened then simply left him in shock. A little knock was heard in the studio. "Who's there?" the detective asked, walking carefully to the room. And then the knocking was heard again. The detective rushed into the studio and found that the window was wide open. Someone must have escaped just now. But as soon as he approached the window, he heard that knocking again, an obnoxious tap that echoed all over the place. The detective turned, and there it was. No one had escaped. To the contrary, someone had entered. No, something. An owl. A medium-sized light brown owl covered in dry dirt had somehow managed to enter the studio and was now tapping against a wall. Detective David sighed, still full of adrenaline. He let out a dry laugh. "Did you get lost, little friend?" he asked the animal as he opened the window widely so the bird could fly out of the place without problem. David reported he had always liked animals, a feature he attributed to living in such a small town in the middle of the forest. But the owl didn't fly out. Instead, it watched the detective with its big, bright eyes insistently, and then it pecked on the same wall again. "Come on. Don't make things more difficult for me. Move," the detective said calmly. The bird flew, but instead of obeying the order, it started throwing things off the shelves and picking up papers. "Stop! You'll mess with the crime scene! Shoo! Shoo!" And waving his arms around, the detective finally managed to scare the owl away. It went away, flying through the same window. That had been strange, David thought. It was almost as if the bird was trying to sign something on that wall. Even if the thought was a bit absurd, the detective had no better clues, and so he tried to check if there was something on that wall. The result was amazing. In that wall, behind some closet organizers, a bulletin board was hidden. It was filled with dozens of strange images, blurry photographs that David could barely understand. Just what was that biologist investigating, he thought, and then he read out loud what was written in a post-it under a strange photograph of a bird mid-flight. Owls can understand. The detective shivered. There was something a little eerie in all of that. Whatever research that man was following, it wasn't really conventional. Through some more thorough examination, the detective found a notebook paper on the floor where a sketch had been drawn. There was a great owl, all in black, flying over the moon. Beneath it, in hurried handwriting, it could be read, "I think I've found something very special while lost in the woods. A bird like no other. A sort of black owl that appears to comprehend human language and situations. It came to me when I was lost and guided me back to the main road to town. I'll have to inquire about this with the local community of professors, perhaps, even with the woodsmen that are already used to the local fauna." The detective's mind was filled with questions, but there were no easy answers. After taking a final look at the place and admitting he would probably get no more clues out of it, David then moved downtown to question both the academic and the sawmill working community of the town. He first checked with a fellow biologist, Dr. Jacobs, who then cleared out some doubts he had about the personality of the lost ornithologist, Michael. "He is very bright, no doubt about it," Dr. Jacobs said. "But the thing about Dr. Michael is his attention. He focuses on things on a very different way to the rest of us, sometimes almost as if he wasn't even on Earth. I tell you, he could chase a bird for hours and wait the whole night in the areas where they are known to appear. Dr. Michael could completely empty his mind and fill it with very valuable information in his community, but at the same time, or perhaps due to that, he would often lose sight of the things of our everyday life. His reputation wasn't exactly the best in town, but perhaps you are more familiar than me with that detective." It was true. The detective could fill the gaps on the record of complaints caused by the young biologist's intrusion in private property. But most of the times, disturbances involving the ornithologist consisted of petty discussions and of the townsfolk not having fully adapted to Michael's rhythm and passion for research. "Yes, I understand. And Dr. Jacobs, if I could bother you with a last question?" Detective David asked. "Did you ever hear anything about a special bird that Dr. Michael was researching?" "Special bird? You mean that owl that always followed him around? That was special, all right. I guess he must have fed that bird a couple of times and now it follows him for more." And that answer lit the detective's attention. "A big black owl?" "No, nor big nor black. A regular owl, light brown." But it seemed that clue hadn't connected to anything else. The forest was full of regular light brown owls, and so David had to stop the interview and drove all the way to one of the sawmills of the town, the one that had reported the more confrontations with Michael. The detective didn't discard the possibility that the bird in Michael's picture would appear. And somehow, as he drove to the sawmill of the town, he could feel as if he was being followed, but every time he stopped his car and looked back, there was not a single car nor a person behind him. The sawyer, described by the detective as a tough, strong man that spoke in a hurry to get back to work, asked to be interviewed briefly, and his answers to David's questions were as followed. "What do you know about Michael, the ornithologist that just arrived in town a few months ago?" "He's a bother, filled with ideas that don't go well with reality. He is always looking for a fight, discussing with us about the animals and whatnot, arguing that we somehow scare them away by doing our job. We've been doing this for centuries and the birds are still here." "Can you tell me more about these discussions? Would you say they could get pretty personal or intense?" "These questions are starting to get on my nerves. Did something happen to the bird watcher? They were simple discussions, never anything too personal or aggressive. The thing is, he often came to try and ask us to do our job more quietly or leave certain areas alone, as if things were as simple as that. Most of the time we just screamed at each other until one of the two sides got tired of it and let the other do whatever they wanted." "Anything else you could say about the ornithologist? We are currently in the middle of an investigation as he has been reported as lost." "Figures! Wouldn't be the first time. That kid has gotten himself lost over a dozen times, and it has always been us the ones that find him. If you're looking for him again, I recommend looking at the northern areas of the forest, near the river." "Noted. Something else? Perhaps something related to a black owl?" "I don't know about the colour, but that kid is always being followed by birds and owls and all of those. Whenever we were arguing, I could feel the gaze of a pair of wide yellow eyes upon me." Detective David felt a shiver on his spine, being a bit familiar already with that feeling. As he exited the sawmill, David couldn't take his mind off the phrase written on the board. Owls can understand? But even though he had his theories, what awaited him at the end of this story was something that he would have never believed if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. David would then follow the directions given by the sawyer and start looking into the woods. The woods of the town were specially dark and humid, filled with beech, maple and oak trees, their branches extended for meters and meters, almost blocking the sky completely. David described the area as silent. Very silent, except for a couple of times where the owls seemed to hoot in the distance, making me feel alert and, honestly, a little unnerved. The detective would walk around the forest tirelessly, yelling the name of the lost researcher, hoping to receive any answer. But only the little critters and birds would answer, by running away from his direction. It was a few minutes later that the most unexpected thing happened. As the detective was taking a break, sitting on a trunk and recovering his breath, he looked up and found a little bird that was staring at him. David recognized the bird immediately. It was the very same one that had been following him along as he drove to meet the doctor and the sawyer, the same that had entered the studio when David first arrived at the ornithologist's place. A medium-sized, light brown owl. The owl stared at the detective from the branch of a tree, and it started hooting gently after their eyes locked. "It was almost as if it was trying to tell me something I couldn't understand," Detective David later reported. "Its eyes were unusually deep, and when I stared at them for enough time, I could almost feel as if that owl was truly communicating and comprehended things on the same level that humans did. That's when it dawned on me I had an idea that, although unusual, I really felt that it could work. I only had to believe." David stood back up and took out a picture of Michael's file, and what happened next felt as if it was all a dream. "Michael! Michael!" the detective explained as he pointed to the picture of the lost ornithologist. The owl then started to hoot even louder, moving and jumping on the branch. Was it really understanding what he was trying to say? David knew that some parrots were smart enough to recognize some words, getting even to repeat them, that some crows were smart enough to solve some puzzles and crack open shells. But could this particular owl really be able to discern who Michael was, because of the photograph or of the sound of the name? It seemed as if the owl was feeling safer with the detective's presence, as it got near him and didn't fly away immediately when David moved. The bird kept trying to see Michael's picture and make contact with the detective's eyes. It was a very strange scene. For a second, when David asked, "Do you know where he is?" he really thought the bird would answer. Detective David reported later that he felt as if he was going a little crazy, trying to make all kinds of connections and explanations that overcame common sense. But in the end, he decided to follow that feeling and see how far it would take him. After all, he had already tried to find him using conventional methods. The next thing the detective did was drive back to Michael's house, and as he looked back, he could see that the owl was flying next to him. He then reported that he realized it must have been the same bird that both the researcher and the sawmill worker had reported that used to follow Michael wherever he went. "I thought that perhaps it had been domesticated in some way. I even thought of feeding it myself as a way of thanking it for its help throughout the case. But what would people think of me if the owl took that as a permission to follow me everywhere I went?" And the detective's instincts seemed to have been put in the right place. Now, paying attention to the movements of the bird inside Michael's house, he could see that it rested on points where he could obtain valuable fragments of information that contained Michael's usual observation spots in the forest. It was until the owl flew around the top of a drawer that David was able to find a notebook with all of the observations related to the black owl of the photographs. The content of that notebook gave David all the context he needed. The insides of the notebook read the following, more or less, as their content was adapted to become a more cohesive read. I think I have found an animal like there is no other. In the brief time since I got to this town, I've gotten myself lost a couple of times. Coming from the coast, the sheer quantity of trees here up north is dizzying. But even though I usually am able to find my way back home, sometimes I have had to stay whole nights in the forest until I managed to find a way out. On one of those days, a particularly cold one, it had gotten too late, and I was already giving up on finding my way back when the most amazing thing happened to me. An owl of a race I had never seen before flew over me. Its body was large and pitch black, as if painted with coal, and its eyes were bright yellow. We looked at each other for a while, and it was almost as if it understood my situation. It hooted and jumped from branch to branch, then it flew away and came back, as if trying to guide me back to the main road. It was an unbelievable situation, but I have always thought that animals can truly understand the cases and dynamics of humans on a deeper level than we imagine. I just know I need to see that black owl again. And the following pages were filled with sketches of the owl, such as the one that David had found in the studio. A few days later, another entry was written. Maybe there's something with the owls in here, something that is worth investigating. I've been approached by another particular bird in a very brief period of time, an owl too, normal, although very smart too. I made the mistake of feeding it once and now it won't stop following me everywhere. Not that I'm complaining. I could really use the company sometimes. I'm still searching for that black owl in the same area where I spotted him once, northwest, where a part of the river falls into a little cliff. No results. Perhaps it is thanks to the lumber company's invasive methods. I hope I can talk with them and convince them of the importance of my research. What if owls are smarter than we think? A good study on this should be revolutionary. Detective David closed the notebook. He already had found all the information he needed. Somehow, he would later report that the owl in front of him seemed almost proud of its work. Perhaps he was giving too much credit to the bird, but it was definitely true that without the owl's help, he would have never found that piece of evidence. And so, David made the right calls and asked for paramedic assistance for once he found Michael. "You'll have to trust me on this one. I really cannot explain more," was the last message of David before he entered the woods. It was part of the townsfolk's common knowledge that the path northwest was specially dangerous, humid and filled with moss and faulty parts, so they used to avoid it. You would need to be crazy to take the path that even most hikers avoid. Detective David admitted that even though he almost fell a couple of times on the path, some parts were specially slippery and muddy, but he had a duty and knew the well-being of Michael was in his hands. At some point, even the owl disappeared, and the detective had to move on his own. Carefully, he continued advancing and yelling for Michael until at last he heard an answer. A voice said, "Here!" And David rushed towards its direction. A few minutes later, the detective and the ornithologist would see each other at last. What David saw was incredible. It now all made sense to him. Michael was bruised and dirty, covered in black mud, but he was laughing. The owl was flying in circles around him. It would rest on his shoulder and jump on the muddy floor near the river, bathing on it as if it was water or sand. The mud stuck to the bird's feathers, almost making him look as if it was pitch black. The ornithologist simply laughed at it. He looked relieved. "You did this for me, buddy? You saved me again?" was what he said a few minutes before losing consciousness due to exhaustion. Detective David contacted the paramedics and had to hold back his tears as he noticed the now mud-covered owl never left the ornithologist's side. And it was true. As he flew, and the day was getting darker, the owl did seem larger and pitch black, like a unique species, and maybe halfway before getting lost, Michael had noticed that. Detective David said he couldn't believe it at all. He was a mess, and of course he was glad when I found him, but he didn't seem very worried to begin with. He would later tell me he lost his awareness of the woods after chasing a bird thinking it was that owl. Then he tripped on the mud and landed on his phone, isolating him completely. But even on his darkest moments, he always had that little owl at his side, At one time, Michael even told me that he remembered the owl had brought him some berries to eat. Then it left him to go back to somewhere else, his house, where I was knocking. I just can't tell how the animal knew that. Guess they do have a sixth sense after all. But at least both the detective and the ornithologist were safe. Michael apologized for the problems caused to the community, and a few weeks later, he would move back to his city to write a paper on the relationship between birds and humans in desperate situations. And of course, he took his new best friend with him. There are still many things I need to know, lots that I don't understand. Why does the owl cover itself in mud like that? Did it learn that by observation? Why did it choose me? How did it understand I was in danger? I have so many questions and so little time, but at least I know this. I am not alone in this research. I started ornithology because I had a feeling there was a lot more to animal intelligence than we give it credit for, and that birds could be the key behind it all. I don't know if I'm close to answering all of those questions, but I really hope I can someday. Michael would say, before closing himself completely for a season of studies, alongside with his unusual partner.